Zoom or YouTube. And that will be turning up here in a second.
I think, Lynn, it means life is going to do it for you. Life, that there's no you that's going to do it. It's going to be life.
Zoom. Yeah, or YouTube. That's what I think too. That's exactly what I think. I think it's just be live living. All right, here we go. And I don't know where you want to start from. The
Uh, the
prefaces or
yeah, the preface would be great. So
okay.
I'm so happy to be here. We're starting Ken Wapnick's PhD book, Volume 1, The Healing Power of Kindness, Releasing Judgment, The Practice of A Course in Miracles. And I'll start with the preface. The idea for this book originated with a talk I gave at our previous center in Roscoe, New York. It came at the end of a 5-day academy class held in September 1996 entitled Sickness and Healing, and the circumstances surrounding my talk go to the heart of this book. I do not recall the many details of the week, but do remember that our teaching staff, my wife Gloria, Rosemarie Lasasso, Jeffrey Siebert, and myself were struck by the paradox of students, on the one hand, spending the week discussing healing in terms of forgiveness and undoing separation, and on the other hand, fervently practicing judgment and condemnation on each other, directly opposite to our teaching and hopefully demonstration, and the kind, gentle tone of Jesus's words in A Course in Miracles. In light of this, I decided to devote the Academy's final session to talking about the kindness of healing, in the hopes of reinforcing Jesus's message of undoing separation by releasing judgment. Needless to say, kindness reflects our inherent oneness with each other, while attack drives us still further apart in our awareness. Therefore, as the next volume in our series of small books on the practice of A Course in Miracles, it seemed appropriate to address this crucial aspect of practicing the Course's kind principles of healing. The core of this book, chapters 1, 2, and 3, is an edited transcript of the original talk. It has been edited to enhance its readability through the informal style of the original presentation that has been essentially maintained. Some passages from A Course in Miracles have been added to expand the discussion, and some specific examples have been included that were gleaned from other classes and workshops to illustrate how healing's kindness can be inadvertently subverted by the ego's need to separate and attack. The introduction is taken from the final chapter to my book, The Message of A Course in Miracles, Volume 1, All Are Called. It is entitled Being Kind, and was also reproduced in our quarterly newsletter, The Lighthouse. It nicely serves to introduce the major theme of this book. Part of the chapter has been moved to this book's conclusion. Finally, 2 other articles from our newsletter, co-authored with my wife, Gloria, are included in the appendix. The first, Do No Harm to Anyone, took its inspiration from the Hippocratic Oath and served as the basis for the article's discussion of being kind and gentle. The second, A Kind and Simple Presentation of a Kind and Simple Message, cautions students against using the Course's metaphysics as an ego ploy, not to do the simple things salvation asks, from the text 31, 1, 2, and 2, which for our purposes we can summarize with the 2-word principle, be kind. The kindness discussed in this book focuses almost exclusively on being kind to others. Volume 2, which will be published separately, focuses on the kindness of forgiving our limitations. As always, I am very grateful to Rosemary Lasasso, our Foundation's Publications Director, for her careful and faithful shepherding of this book from its inception through its excellent editing to its finished form. I would especially like to thank my wife, Gloria, who patiently spoke to me for years of putting out little books like these. I finally listened, and no doubt a message lies in that. Introduction. Jesus's inspirational message to the world in A Course in Miracles, with its beautiful language, brilliant logic, and blessed words of love, means nothing if it is not lived and practiced. That is why he makes the following important statement in the text, which can be taken as a caution to all of his students not to repeat the mistakes of the past 2,100 years of seeking to teach his message without first seeking to learn it for themselves. Teach not that I died in vain. Teach rather that I did not die, by demonstrating that I live in you. From the text, chapter 11, volume 7, 3 through 4. In other words, we teach Jesus' message of undoing the ego's thought system of death by living our lives based on his teachings on forgiveness. This undoes the ego's lessons of hate, attack, and murder, and thus is the efficacy of his message demonstrated not by our words, but by our life. Teaching is done in many ways, above all by example. The text, chapter 5, volume 5 through 1. This principle of teaching what we have first accepted for ourselves is nicely articulated in the workbook lesson, I Am Among the Ministers of God, where Jesus can again be seen encouraging his students not to make his teachings something they do, but rather having his students be what they seek to become. There is one major difference in the role of heaven's messengers, which sets them off from those the world appoints. The messages that they deliver were intended first for them, and it is only as they can accept them for themselves that they become able to bring them further and to give them everywhere that they were meant to be. Like earthly messengers, they did not write the messages they hear, but they become their first receivers in the truest sense, receiving to prepare themselves to give. The workbook 154. This inability to truly practice A Course in Miracles, kind principles of forgiveness that they study and sometimes even teach, has perhaps been the most serious failing among its students. In Few Choose to Listen, Volume 2 of the Message of A Course in Miracles, I discuss how students often conceal their thought system of specialness and judgment under the guise of spiritual counseling or friendship. Thus, they are quick to remind someone in pain or in mourning, for example, that the body and death are illusions and defenses against the truth. And so why not, they urge their family members or friends, just change your mind. The absence of simple kindness is unfortunately unmistakable to all except the course student, making the spiritual pronouncements. In this regard, I am always reminded of the classic movie Lost Horizon, the 1938 adaptation of James Hilton's wonderful novel. As some readers may recall, at the beginning of the film, Conway, the protagonist played by Ronald Colman, is abducted and brought to Shangri-La, a paradisal community in the Himalayas, inhabitants of which do not grow old. He has been brought there to become its new leader, as the ancient Lama, its founder and guiding inspiration, is preparing to die. In one of the film's most memorable moments, the Lama makes a speech to the reluctant Conway, in which he explains the origin and purpose of his utopian oasis. It is an inspiring scene, and its climax comes in the following summary statement, remarkable for its prophetic words that have, sadly to say, been more than realized in the decades that have been passed since they were first spoken on the screen. I need a little water. It came to me in a vision long, long ago. I saw all the nations strengthening, not in wisdom, but in the vulgar passions and the will to destroy. I saw the machine power multiplying until a single weaponed man might match a whole army. I foresaw a time when man, exulting in the technique of murder, would rage so hotly with the world that every book, every treasure would be doomed to destruction. This vision was so vivid and so moving that I determined to gather together all things of beauty and of culture that I could and preserve them here against the doom toward which the world is rushing. Look at the world today. Is there anything more pitiful? What madness there is, what blindness, what unintelligent leadership, a scurrying mass of humanity crashing headlong against each other, upheld by an orgy of greed and brutality. A time must come when this orgy will spend itself, when brutality and the lust for power must perish by its own sword. For when that day comes, the world must begin to look for a new life, and it is our hope that they may find it here. For here we shall be with their books and their music and a way of life based on one simple rule, be kind. When that day comes, it is our hope that the brotherly love of Shangri-La will spread throughout the world. Yes, when the strong have devoured each other, the Christian ethic may at last be fulfilled, and the meek shall inherit the earth. What could be simpler, and yet what is more difficult? Since our thoughts were not kind about God in that original instant of separation, all that followed in the hologram of time and space could not help being unkind. Ideas leave not their source. Unkindness must lead to unkindness. The little willingness that Jesus repeatedly states is all that is asked of us by the Holy Spirit can best be understood as the willingness to be kind, or perhaps better, the willingness to be taught to be kind. In that ontological instant, the beginning of the ego's nightmare dream of judgment, when we placed our selfish desire for individuality above all else, kindness was lost to us, and we forgot that kindness created us kind. Workbook 67, paragraph 2 and 4. And so we need to learn from Jesus, the one who symbolizes and exemplifies this kindness of heaven to us. how to release judgment and be kind to others and ourselves. Hopefully, this little book will help remind us all of the need to be kind, the spiritual principle par excellence. That's the end of the introduction. And now we'll start chapter 1, the kindness of healing.
So I was just gonna say, I hope you don't mind if I speak up a little bit. That movie, Lost Horizons, I
Yes.
saw that when I was a little kid. That was what inspired me to start seeking. I thought that place was real. And
Wow.
I had this idea in my mind as a little kid that there was a mysterious place up in the mountains somewhere. I lived up in the mountains. I had this idea there was this mysterious place up in the mountains that this spiritual place was. And I saw it as a spiritual place. I didn't get the cultural bits of it. For some reason, it seemed to me like it was a holy thing. And so I remember that movie my whole life. And, when I first started reading uh, Autobiography of a Yogi, when I was like 14, 15 maybe, uh, he talked about places that were like that in the Autobiography of the Yogi. So I was sure that that place really existed. And, it's just so interesting to me because that's what set off the fever for finding a different spiritual way. So I love that Ken brought that up.
Oh, that's really interesting that you saw that movie and that it had affected him so much, Ken, so much that he included it in the book, and passages from it. So, yeah, I mean, there could be a Shangri-La community there somewhere. It's
Well, I had a desire my whole life to build a place like that then too. Soon as I got to be a teenager, I was thinking, of course, I had a real good friend and we were really into The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. This was back in the 60s. So that was when that first became like really popular. And we had this whole idea of going up in the mountains and building a community that would be like that. Just amazing. And I think a lot of other people had that same inspiration because a lot of communes and stuff came up at the same time. But anyway, I just think it's interesting. I'm glad you're reading this.
Yeah, I think it's a wonderful thought because uh, it it could work if more people were right-minded within that community or commune and not living from the ego. I
Yeah.
mean, it could work. You're still in a body to the body's laws operating, but you would be coming from love in everything that you do. Not you wouldn't be coming from lack, from a sense of lack. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, my friend and I mean, we had drawings, of how we were going to build the mountain wall so that invaders couldn't come in, and we could have. In it's amazing what teenage kids get up to or did in the 60s. I suppose probably LSD and marijuana had something to do with part of that, but still, it was very much looking for Shangri-La, very much so. All
Yeah,
right.
well, yeah, very nice. I mean, that movie probably inspired a lot of the communes that, you know, tried after that. So, yeah,
So
great.
cool. All right. I will let you go on. And I see Regis is here. Hi, Regis.
Okay. Chapter 1, The Kindness of Healing. I would like to focus specifically on the attitude and behavior of a student of A Course in Miracles in the presence of someone who is sick. One would think this should not be a crucial issue. Unfortunately, however, I can assure you that in the more than 20 years, now almost 30, since A Course in Miracles was published in 1976, it has been and continues to be a major problem. Thus, I would like to discuss it both in terms of theory and above all practice. While we will focus mainly on sickness, it will become obvious as we go along that the principles we examine can easily be applied to other areas as well. For example, how one deals with a person mourning the death of a loved one, having a seemingly insoluble problem, or is just upset. As many of you know, either because you have been victims of it, or perhaps in a moment of weakness have victimized others this way, it is all too easy to deal with the anxiety engendered when you are with someone in pain by quoting A Course in Miracles, a nice way of saying hitting them over the head with the Blue Book. Its principles of help and healing then become subtle and sometimes not so subtle ways of passing judgment and attacking others. I have said many times that when you have a problem or are sick or in trouble, the last person you should call is a course student. And unless that person is well trained, the last person you should go to for psychotherapy is a course student. In all likelihood, you will only have a bunch of coarse platitudes thrown at you. What do you mean your mind isn't healed yet? I thought you were a good student. I thought you believed that this world is an illusion. Come, let us pray or meditate so you can be restored to your right mind. It has been quite a while since Gloria and I have told this story, but it remains one of our unfavorite stories, and unfortunately a true one. A member of a course group became gravely ill, cancer, as I recall. She was in the hospital and dying. Before her death, she was visited regularly by other members of the group, who were obviously quite upset that this longtime student of A Course in Miracles was sick, with cancer, no less, and even worse, was dying. Rather than do what normal friends would do for someone in pain, they quoted the Course to her, in effect saying, if you were really serious about this Course, you would get out of that bed and come home with us. Don't you know that sickness is a defense against the truth? Workbook, lesson 136. We have a meeting tonight, and I would like you to be there. That last part I made up, but the point of the story is clear. Needless to say, the friend was quite hurt and upset. Gloria and I use this story to exemplify how easily people can fall into that trap. The mistake the group members made was not so much the unkindness and judgment toward their friend, but in not paying attention to their own anxiety, not looking at what was going on within themselves. No one could ever be unkind or withhold love unless they were first racked with guilt and fear. That is self-evident. There cannot be anything other than love or fear in our minds. As A Course in Miracles tells us, we have but two emotions. One we made, fear, and one was given us, love. Textbook 13, volume, and then it says textbook 12, 1.9, 5 through 6. If you have chosen Jesus or the Holy Spirit as your teacher, anything you say or do will come from them and will be loving. If, however, you have chosen the ego as your teacher, which means guilt and fear have taken the place of love, anything you say or do will come from guilt and fear. If you do not pay attention to the guilt, it will be repressed, and whatever is repressed will be projected. When guilt is projected, it takes the form of attack, either on yourself, sickness, or on someone else. anger. No one in his or her right mind would pretend that attack is loving. What really happened in that group was that the members were upset that this person was a serious student of A Course in Miracles and yet became ill. Each one must have been thinking, what does that mean about me? I am also a serious student, and so this could happen to me too. The concern was certainly not about their friend, but about themselves. Again, their mistake was in not paying attention to their anxiety and consequently using the Course as a cover for it. They thus walked into the hospital room and projected their own anxiety, which came from guilt, and in effect said to the poor woman, "You're the guilty one, and we need you to prove to us that this course works, that if you practice A Course in Miracles, you will never get sick. We need you to demonstrate that to us, not because we care whether you live or die, but because we care whether we live or die. We need you to be the proof that one can be a student of the Course and get well, and certainly not die." Thus, their judgmental behavior was not due to sin or wickedness, but fear, but they did not pay attention to it. That is why I stress the importance of constant vigilance for what is going on inside you. One of the general rules I always advocate is that you be normal. Try to stop and think what normal people would do in a situation like this. They would be kind, gentle, and consoling, and would certainly not attack or make the patient feel guilty. From everything you have heard and read in your study of A Course in Miracles, you know that sickness has nothing to do with the physical symptom, but with the thought system built on our belief that we are separate from God. That is the sickness. The woman who was suffering in the hospital bed was obviously feeling separated, and therefore the last thing in the world she needed was for her good friends to come in and make her feel even more separated. If they had been in their right minds, they would have realized the woman's sickness and suffering was most likely coming from her fear and guilt, and her fear of dying would have found expression in her thinking. This is God's vengeance on me, and I am being punished. My individual existence is going to be snuffed out because of my sin. Whether those thoughts were conscious or not, they would have been present in her mind as the source of tremendous fear. Once you understand the source of sickness in the mind's decision to be separate, you will realize you are joined with that person in the same sickness. No mind is sick until another mind agrees that they are separate, and thus it is their joint decision to be sick. If you withhold agreement and accept the part you play in making sickness real, the other mind cannot project its guilt without your aid in letting it perceive itself as separate and apart from you. Thus is the body not perceived as sick by both your minds from separate points of view. Uniting with a brother's mind prevents the cause of sickness and perceived effects. Healing is the effect of minds that join, as sickness comes from minds that separate. The text 28. And then it says, 3, and 2. That is why Jesus teaches over and over again in his course that if you want to be healed, you must let yourself be an extension of healing for someone else. If you want to be forgiven, you must ask his help that you forgive someone else. For only then will you understand that you and that person are the same. To state it quite simply and succinctly, when with someone, always try to be kind. Lesson 67 states, kindness created me kind. Workbook 67, paragraph 4. When you are acting unkindly, clearly you are acting in a way that is discordant with the way God created you. Recall the speech of the Lama of Shangri-La that I quoted in the introduction. When you set aside the brilliant metaphysics of A Course in Miracles and its sophisticated psychological insights, the Course could be pared down to the Lama's one simple rule: be kind. If you are not kind, then not only are you not practicing the Course, but there is no way you can even begin to understand it. No matter how brilliant your understanding of its metaphysics may be, if you are not being kind toward another person, especially when that person is in trouble, in fear, pain, or whatever, you are not doing what this course is asking. A Course in Miracles helps us understand why we are not kind. If we believe we have not been kind to God, attacking him in order to exist in our own, we inevitably believe he will not be kind to us. But we repress that threatening thought, split it off, project it out, and make a world in which we then feel justified in being unkind. That is the origin of our unkindness. However, if you do not do something about it, the unkindness remains along with the guilt. You have to be especially careful not to mask the judgmental attacks with your coarse words of kindness. In the next chapter, I will talk about judgment, an important underpinning of our unkindness. I am occasionally asked if I would say something about Mother Teresa, who did such wonderful work, whose spirituality and theology were miles apart from the Course. I like to point out that her spirituality consisted of doing what the love of Jesus told her to do. Whatever theological terms she couched her ethic in, that was her bottom line. She coached her ethic in, that was her bottom line. Compared with A Course in Miracles, her metaphysics and theology would clearly seem to be of the ego. It was very much rooted in the body, which Jesus, being the only Son of God, the one who came to redeem us from our very real sin. But how many Course in Miracles students would you want to stack up against her with all their brilliant theological and metaphysical understanding? Again, if you really want to make progress in this course, you must practice being kind, which very often means leaving your blue book behind, but not its author. You do leave the words behind if you are not helpful, and many times they are not. But if you take Jesus with you, you will be as kind as he is. To repeat what I said in my opening comments, I am sure many of you, possibly most of you, especially if you have been around A Course in Miracles for a while, have either been the recipient or the perpetrator of these sinful course offenses of hitting people over the head with its principles. Do try to remember that if someone is in pain, dying of cancer, or even doing something unconscionable or vicious, the source of their behavior is the same fear working in your own mind, and that is what unites you. Therefore, in learning how to be kind toward another person, you are practicing being kind toward yourself, because you and your brother are one. You are not different. This goes directly to the heart of the ego's thought system. The concept of difference is how the ego began. God and his son were separate and different and undoes it. It is this unconscious identification with the ego's need for differences to prove its victory over God's oneness. That is the ultimate motivation behind our unkindness, especially when practiced in the name of Jesus and his course. Question. I was with a friend whose husband had died, and she asked me how A Course in Miracles views death. She is not a student of the course, but what I said made her angry, so I assume I was not being kind. Answer. Not necessarily. Being kind does not always mean the other person will be accepting of your kindness. What is important is that you recall, as best you can, what was going on within you. Of course, it is possible you are not being kind, but it is also possible that you were. It is certainly impossible to judge someone else, but it is equally impossible to judge yourself and know your inner motivation. If you feel you are peaceful and not trying to conceal anxiety, anger, or fear, you need not go any further with it. Sometimes you can be very loving toward someone, and that person will still get angry. If you are in a relationship that is based on a secret vow of mutual anger and attack, marriages of that nature have lasted 50, 60, or more years, and all of a sudden, one of the partners becomes kind and announces, I don't want to do this anymore. The other person will be very angry. You're not acting the way we agreed. You are supposed to be miserable and nasty, so I can feel unfairly treated. Again, I don't know what your motivation was at that point, but because the other person became upset does not necessarily mean that you were being unkind. I think it is something to look at, but being kind and gentle as you do so, and don't do a number on yourself. Question. Suppose you have two Course in Miracles students, one of whom is sick and the other is constantly reminding him that this is a dream. Answer. Again, it depends on the motivation. If you are reminding your sick friend that the world is a dream and sickness is a defense, you should look within yourself and try to determine whether you are coming from a loving space. If your friend is a Course in Miracles student, the chances are she is aware intellectually that this world is a dream and sickness is a defense against the truth. If that were the case, to remind her of that is not very loving or caring. It is like rubbing salt in the wound or stepping on a person who is already down. Surely there are times when a reminder can be loving and helpful, but very often it is not. Again, you should always use being normal as a criterion. Normal people in the presence of someone who is sick, especially a friend or family member, are kind. You do not have to be a spiritual giant or understand the difference between non duality and duality to know that if someone is sick and in pain, kindness should be offered to that person. Similarly, it is not loving to reprimand a person who is watching a news program with you and who gets upset over scenes of bombings, genocide, or starvation. What are you so upset about? It's all a dream. It's their script. Sadly, there are numerous accounts of students doing just that. Anyone who makes such unloving comments must be coming from a fearful place. And rather than look within and ask Jesus' help to deal with the fear, the person simply ignores it because it reminds them of their own hostility and threat of annihilation. As I have been stressing, when you do not look at fear or guilt, they will automatically be pushed down in your unconscious, and just as automatically will be projected out, always. Inevitably, then, you end up judging and attacking other people. Like a stone rolling down a mountain, it is relatively easy to stop it if you get it at the beginning because it has not picked up any speed. However, if you let it roll down some distance, it becomes much more difficult, if not impossible to stop. In fact, it becomes outright dangerous. Once your ego really gets going, it is very hard to stop yourself because at that point you are on your spiritual high horse. The other person is on the ground, and it feels so good to beat him up. Remember, the ego's cardinal principle is always one or the other. And so, if I can prove that you are a poor student of A Course in Miracles, I clearly am the good one. That feels so good that it is more difficult to stop. Progress in the Course can be measured by the speed with which you identify your fear, not by your not having it. If you identify the fear, it won't go anywhere. But if you don't, and instead push it down, it festers inside until it explodes. Thus, before you know it, you will find yourself in the throes of a major ego attack directed either towards someone else or yourself. What also frequently happens with people who study the Course is that they become very cliquish. There is a unique vocabulary in A Course in Miracles, which works fine amongst Course students. Everyone knows what specialness and atonement are, what it means to look at the ego, and so on. But it is not loving to use those same words and concepts when you are among people who do not know what you are talking about. It is not helpful, and it certainly is not kind. When you find yourself not acting or speaking in a kindly way, when you are at a wake, for example, and you go around with a smile on your face, saying to grieving friends and relatives, "Don't be upset. No one dies without his own consent." Workbook 152, paragraph 1 and 4. You should want to stop it as soon as you can and then not feel guilty about it. Simply understand where the unkindness comes from and then try to undo the cause, which invariably will be, I wanted to be on my own and did not consult with Jesus before I went to the funeral home. You do not have to consult with him about what to say but it is essential that you consult with him about what is going on inside you. In one of his personal messages to Helen, Jesus said, "Remember, you need nothing, but you have an endless store of loving gifts to give. But teach this lesson only to yourself. Your brother will not learn it from your words or from the judgments you have laid on him. You need not even speak a word to him. You cannot ask, 'What shall I say to him?' and hear God's answer. Rather, ask instead, 'Help me to see this brother through the eyes of truth and not of judgment,' and the help of God and all his angels will respond." From Ken's book, Absence from Felicity, page 381. That was the story of Helen, his biography of Helen. Therefore, you do not have to ask Jesus what to say when you visit someone in the hospital or one who has suffered a personal loss. Do ask him, though, for help in leaving your ego behind. If you cannot even do that, at least ask his help to be kind. At least try to enunciate for yourself that your goal is to be kind. Even if you sense that your ego is going wild, you can still be kind through realizing you have a split mind that is obviously divided between kindness and unkindness, Jesus and the ego, happiness and pain. Such honesty is a first step. It does not undo your ego, your secret desire to be unkind, but it does express your desire to want to do things differently. Even though at this point you do not think you can, there still is a part of you that really wants to, and so, at the very least, you will not try to justify, rationalize, or spiritualize your unkind comments. You will, in simple honesty, acknowledge to yourself, "I said this, and obviously I was not in my right mind. I was not being gentle, kind, or loving, and did not listen to the other person. All I cared about was myself." Question. And if you do not go through that process, you are going to feel guilty and rejected? Answer. Absolutely. And feeling guilty will impel you to attack again and again and again. That is what we refer to as the guilt attack cycle, the ego's bread and butter. The guiltier you feel, the more you will project it out and perceive yourself as the innocent one, justified in attacking the guilt you see in others. Yet the more you attack, the guiltier you will feel. Thus, the cycle continues and nothing ever changes. Once again, you can at least express to yourself, to Jesus, or the Holy Spirit your desire to be kind. I don't know how to be kind, but that is my goal, to be kind, gentle, caring, and loving. If you can sincerely do that, even when you start to judge or spout coarse platitudes, you will no longer attempt to justify what you are doing and will realize you are not being kind at all. Question. Can we do this in other circumstances, even if someone is not physically ill? Answer. Yes, of course. I am using physical illness as the primary example, but you can apply this whenever you are with someone who is upset for any reason, including yourself. Remember, the sickness is not the physical symptom. Sickness is the expression of the belief, I am separated from God and prefer my individuality to the oneness of Christ. Regardless of why someone is not at peace, whether it is a physical, emotional, financial, or relationship problem, it is still the same sickness, for it comes from the same source of separation. A student from New York told me of his experience with other course students after the 9/11 attacks. He was talking with them about how traumatic it had been dealing not only with his own fear and distress, but also with frantic relatives who were frightened for the safety of their children who were in school and for spouses who were at their jobs in Manhattan or stranded on business trips in other parts of the country, etc. After sharing these experiences, one of his course friends said, "Oh, I didn't take it seriously. I knew what it was about. I knew that it was meaningless and that it was all an illusion." Needless to say, he felt he had just been judged a course failure, even though his friend did not say that explicitly. If your mind is healed of the belief in the illusionary world of separation, there would be nothing there but, turn the page, the kind and gentle love of Jesus. And there would never be a need to announce that you know attack and fear are illusionary. You would be sensitive to the fear in others and not separate yourself from them by tactically letting them know that you have advanced far beyond where they are. Granted, most people do not usually let go of the belief in separation in one single instant of healing. More commonly, they learn how to take themselves and the events of their lives less and less seriously. Still, though, kindness would dictate that they at least be present to the pain in others and try gently to comfort them rather than exasperate the problem through playing the game of spiritual one-upmanship. Another example of the unkindness of insensitive students of A Course in Miracles came during one of our workshops in Roscoe. Shortly before dinner, discussion in the class focused on one student who related still another course horror story. She had some cardiac problems, which medication helped to alleviate, and she was sharing her experience with her weekly group. To her hurt and amazement, a number of her friends began to attack her for resorting to the magic of medicine rather than the Course's miracle of healing. She was accused in characteristic ego fashion of not being a good student, etc. Her bringing this up in my workshop allowed me to discuss many of the ideas already expressed in this book, and the session ended with the woman feeling considerably relieved. At some point during dinner, however, she came up to me practically in tears. While waiting in the cafeteria line for her food, the very same thing happened all over again. A participant in the session that just ended approached her with the exact same accusation. Unlike Heraclitus, is that Heraclitus?
Heraclitus.
Heraclitus, thank you. Ever-changing river, some things never change, or so it would seem. To cite another example shared by a student in one of my classes, we can even be unkind toward ourselves about our unkindness to others. A student, Pat, was having a problem with Alice, a woman living in her neighborhood. When Alice would see Pat in the park where they both would go regularly, she would sit next to Pat and begin to talk. Pat found the conversation terribly boring and also intrusive on her relaxation time. So Pat wanted to know if she were still being a good course student if she didn't want to talk to Alice. Sometimes Pat would stay and talk, but feel resentful about it. And other times she would get up and leave, thinking that was all right to do, but then later feel guilty about having left. After all, Pat berated herself. Alice is just as much a member of the sonship as she is. Pat wanted to know whether it would be more loving to stay and pretend she were interested in what Alice had to say, even though she was not. My response to Pat centered on two of the basic points we have already touched upon. First, the importance of always being normal. And second, the problem is never what is happening in the world, the form, but always with one's choice of the ego rather than Jesus as one's teacher, the content. It's 11:59. Did you want me to go to the end? We're almost at the end of chapter 1,
Yeah,
Lynn.
sure. Yeah, go ahead and go to the
Is that
end.
okay?
Yeah.
We all have our preferences of likes and dislikes, food, colors, personality types, music, hairstyles, movie, climates, and so on. That is a fact of our existence in this world as bodies and has nothing to do with our spiritual status. Therefore, we need but acknowledge our preferences without making them into an issue. Pat could simply have recognized that she preferred not to spend time with Alice without hating or judging her, and certainly without making the situation into some kind of cosmic spiritual test, which she appeared to have failed. Pat essentially crucified herself by thinking, I should be able to be with anyone and talk about anything. The kind and gentle approach would have been to have simply acknowledged, this is the self I think I am. I like food. A. I like movie. A. I prefer to be with person A. In that spirit, Pat could simply have excused herself and then sat somewhere else or gone back to her apartment, and she would have remained peaceful throughout. Pat was not peaceful, however, which means that she chose the ego as her teacher instead of Jesus. Her decision not to stay with Alice became a sin for which she felt terribly guilty, always a sign of having chosen the ego. That was Pat's miracle. It was not her not wanting to be with Alice. It was her choosing the ego as her teacher. Being in a body already means we have chosen the ego's thought system of one or the other. So Pat could have realized, if I didn't want to be with God, why would I want to be with this woman? In other words, there is no difference between Pat seeing herself as separate from God and seeing herself as separate from Alice. Our judging against others is no different from our judging against God. It is just a shadowy fragment of the tiny mad idea. This echoes the first principle of miracles, that there is no order or hierarchy among them, which undoes the ego's first law of chaos, that there is a hierarchy of illusions. From the text, chapter 23, 2 and 3. Had Pat joined with Jesus instead of the ego, she would not have judged herself for excluding Alice from her love, but she also would not have justified excluding her. And finally, she would have recognized that seeing Alice as separate was an obstacle to her experience the peace and love of God that is within her. So kindness toward herself would be manifested in forgiving herself for not being perfect in her love for all people, her humble acceptance of her limitations, and not attacking herself because of them. Jesus does not care about form, about whether or not you spend time with person A, B, or C. He cares about content, what is going on in your mind, whether or not you exclude people, including himself, in your mind. As I indicated, our assumption that we can rightly judge both ourselves and others is what fuels our unkindness. And so I would like now to turn to some passages in A Course in Miracles that speak directly to this underlying and infectious dynamic. The equally damaging confusion of form and content will be highlighted as well. And that's the end of chapter 1. And then we'll next week begin chapter 2, the judgment and the belief in differences, the basis of unkindness.
So thank you so much, Mickey, for this. I've really been enjoying reading along with you and really looking at how I'm dealing with things and yeah, it's wonderful.
Yeah, it's really nice. It brings up some stuff in my own life. So yeah.
Yeah. So if any time you want to talk about things while we're reading along, it'd be great as well. Uh,
Okay.
but I mean, whatever you want to do, this is your
Sure.
deal.
Yeah. Sounds great.
All
Yeah.
right.
Thanks,
I,
Michale. So happy you read that book. I
yeah.
always wanted to read it, and this is perfect.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for being here, Karen. Thank you, Regis. Thank you, all of you.
Okay.